All right, folks, so I cannot allow us to go through this week and not finish off this unit on social insects. The first portion, I'll cover ants, which are modified wasps, and bees, which are modified wasps, in the next lecture. So last time we were talking about, and these are the broad umbrella brushstrokes that we're talking about, brushstrokes right now in this lecture about all social insects and uniting themes, and then we'll talk about wasps. So last time I talked about how the historic view is that social insect societies have queens and soldiers and nurses, and that they each do the things that they're supposed to do and they're good at, and in aggregate, the whole society does better. A little well-oiled machine, rigid, but perfectly evolved via evolution to meet the challenges of the colony, and that adjustments to ratios of those different types of individuals are how societies meet dynamic challenges. Then I said, basically, that's not true. In fact, ants switch jobs kind of all the time. And many ants don't appear, and bees and wasps switch jobs all the time. And then many of them don't seem to really even have a job, so which we'll cover next. So Deborah Gordon at Stanford University was reviled in the literature for 3 or 4 decades as like that thing that goes bump in the night, because she was going around challenging all of these views of social insect societies as like these highly rigid, like structural societies, castes, when actually ants switch jobs all the time based on what a society needs. It's a flexible workforce that has to be allocated based on moment-to-moment and day-to-day needs. So task associations between workers and tasks are flexible. So one of the main insights that she just, at face value is that most social insect societies don't have worker polymorphism. So like, yes, there are queens, yes, there are workers, but like soldiers and nurses in most insect societies look the same. They might be different ages, they might be different individuals, but morphologically they look very similar. And so what law of physics prevents a nurse from just being like, all right, I'm not going to nurse, I'm going to now go excavate, right? Or an excavator from switching to colony defense. It just didn't stand to reason that it was always morphology and structural rigidity between worker and task that enabled a society to function so effectively, so efficiently. So she rather pondered that the reason that social insect societies are so successful is because they have a small number of rules that allow them to flexibly allocate workers, a dynamic system. So she also showed that the evidence that specialists, like individuals that do their job over and over and over and over and over, are actually better than other kinds of individuals performing those tasks, or generalists, was mostly absent. And so, for instance, on the right-hand side here are a bunch of scatter plots from a social insect society, an acorn ant. And on the x-axis is the degree of specialization. So to the right would be ants that are very, very specialized on a task. All the way to the left would be an ant that basically is switching tasks all the time. And on all of these tasks, which include performance in brood transports on the top. The second panel is honey foraging. These are ants, but she gives them a little glob of honey, and she went out and saw who was collecting that honey and how efficiently. Fly foraging, stone collection. And basically, all I want you to get from these scatter plots, performance is on the x-axis, so high values are really efficient individuals that are making transports all the time, and on the bottom are really inefficient individuals. And what she found is that there's really no association between specialization and efficiency. So for this social insect society, and indeed many that she looked at, that many have looked at since, there are no associations between being specialized and being efficient at that task. Now there's a little bit of evidence to the contrary. So there are like these old studies that look at ants that have very obvious worker polymorphisms, right? There's a clear giant major caste and a tiny little soldier, a minor caste. So soldier and nurse, major or minor. We use major or minor more generally, just like because both of them tend to do lots of different things. So yeah, sometimes these tiny little individuals do defend the colony, and sometimes these big giant individuals do care for young. So like, we don't call them soldiers and nurses, we refer to them as majors and minors. Anyway, so an old study by, I think it's James Trinello at Boston University, showed that, yeah, these majors are more efficient at cutting tough leaves. So if you just look at how quickly they both cut, these minors and these majors, there's no difference. If you look at how efficiently, in terms of how much oxygen they consume and CO2 they produce while they're working at this task, and you look at soft leaves, there are no differences. But if you look at tough leaves, tough rhododendron leaves, and you look at how efficiently per unit CO2 expelled, you see that these larger majors are more efficient energetically at cutting tough plant material. Well, there it is, right? Efficiency. But the problem with studies like that is like, how do we know that that's what's important? The amount of CO2 produced when cutting tough leaves? So it's not the speed that they're doing it. They're both equally fast, despite the fact that this one has huge mandibles. This one has tiny little mandibles. And who's to say tough leaves are the important ones? Or that it's energetic efficiency and not time that's the currency of interest? Really, studies like this might tell us that people are just searching for an outcome, that it just looks so obvious that this one should be good at cutting and this one shouldn't be. And most of the time, that's just not true. And so people look at these very tiny specific conditions and these very specific response variables, and you can see these kinds of specialist efficiency associations, but most of the time, they're just really fuzzy if they're there at all. So again, the idea that there's like a rigid society and everyone has their inborn instinctual guidance counselor kind of just falls out the window. So elites. Elite ants are ants that do a lot. So it turns out if you paint every little ant inside of a society and you just watch it do its thing, turns out that almost every bit of work that happens in the ant society is done by just a few individuals. Who's caring for the brood? Just a small number of individuals. When the colony needs to be transported, who transports all the brood and all of the colony members? Sometimes just one or two individuals. Who's attending the queen? Just one or two individuals. Well, are those different individuals? The ones that care for brood and move them and forage and transport the whole society if it needs to be transported, those must be different individuals. As often as not, that's not true. Oftentimes, there are elite individuals which perform a disproportionately large amount of work in almost every context. So you might ask yourself, what are the other ants doing? Turns out they just appear to be lazy. They're just waiting around, doing something. In most instances, between 60 and 90% of the ants inside the society never appear to do anything of any importance. I mean, maybe they're important under certain special conditions out in the field, but we won't know. Whenever we're looking at them, they're not working hard. And so many ants appear to be lazy. A less common category of ants are ants that are bustling around. They appear to be doing something, but actually they never accomplish anything at all. Can you imagine? I mean, it makes sense, like if you do nothing, then at least you're saving energy, right? So there could be a day you do something. But then the fact that there's this other category of individuals, the busy little bees that just never accomplish anything, like that's why? And they're wasting all that time and energy and they never get anything done. And they're more common than elites. Amazing. No surprise, in a large society, the proportion of individuals that never accomplish anything gets greater and greater and greater. But in a small society, the one or two workers that are around, they become elites. So you might take some sort of like conservative Republican type view and say, see, a big giant society just breeds laziness. But the reality is that for these ants, it might just require very little work to make the society go, and you don't need to have every individual working hard. You can save them for some sort of other task later on that would happen in the wild that we just don't have in lab, because ants in lab have pretty feather-bedded conditions and probably have a pretty easy life. So most ants are completely inactive and some are actively useless, like just they don't accomplish anything. Elites are not keystone individuals. So if you take the one or two elites out, like those busy, hardworking individuals that get everything done, guess what? Some other individual that was just sitting on its butt for the whole time, it just gets up and goes and starts working. My God, it sounds like a conservative like propaganda pitch. I mean, if you take away the individuals that are enabling all these lazy ants, some of them just spontaneously become less lazy and just take on those same roles as those elite individuals, and those lazy ants would be just as good usually, as those elite individuals were. And if not, then they quickly become as efficient as those elite individuals that you raptured out of the society, that you removed or murdered. Lazy ants are not shift workers. That should say not shift workers. So there was another hypothesis that like individuals take turns being the lazy ants. Nope, that's not true either. It turns out those busy little, like, you know, just energetic elites that get everything done, they're always getting everything done, day and night, day and day and day, right? So like, unless they die or unless they vanish, those lazy ants never get up and go. But then even catastrophic things in the lab, like we destroy the whole colony, we rip it apart, and they have to move everything in a fit. You would imagine under those circumstances, surely to God, those lazy ants must do something under those, right? Total catastrophe, annihilation. Nope, they don't do anything then either. It's still just that small number of elites, like 10% of individuals that basically just do everything. Amazing. So, despite the fact that ant societies are totally unlike what you probably imagine them being, and indeed bee societies are similar to this kind of outcome, and indeed many wasp societies are usually a little more active because there aren't that many workers in most wasp societies, so yeah, most individuals have to do something. And in wasp societies, most females that at least start the colony together can produce workers of their own and daughter queens of their own. So there's also the idea that like when there's nothing to do, they start trying to cheat and lay their own eggs. So in wasp societies, there's less sloth. In ant societies, bee societies, bumblebee societies, lots of sloth. Lots of individuals that never accomplish anything. But despite the fact that lots of social insect societies are filled with layabouts, social insects have still taken over the world. I mean, by some metrics, they're much more successful than humans. I mean, and we rely on them, right? So 80% of the world's plants are pollinated by honeybees. And almost every domestic cultivar, lines of plants that we consume, are pollinated by bees. Since the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, we've been domesticating honeybees and moving them up and down next to crops. We used to, in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, they would put honeybee colonies on top of boats next to flooded agricultural sites, and then just move the colonies back and forth past those crops. We knew then that these bees were fertilizing those crops. We knew then that their presence in our world was essential for crop cycling and production, plant mating systems. Okay, so that's all well and good. So they're great for pollination. I mean, in tropical biomes, social insects, ants, just ants, make up 25% of the total animal biomass in the system. So like the total amount of ants in a rainforest or a savanna or an arid tropical grassland or cloud forest, ants sum up all their biomass, much greater than all of the vertebrates combined. Amazing, amazing. I mean, there are lots of beetles and things too, but basically, it's just filled with ants. They cycle all the plant material and are responsible for huge amounts of decomposition. They are major predators. They defend lots of plants in the rainforest. They even pollinate lots of plants in the rainforest. I mean, they disperse seeds across the landscape. They perform so many of the ecological functions that make tropical ecosystems go. I mean, in a tundra in the northern portion of Canada, which I always mispronounce. I want to call it Nunavut. Anyway, so when I was a child, that did exist. So I'm gonna mispronounce that. But like if you're in tundra, then ants can't really move, and so they're less important. But as you get closer and closer to the equator, ants are basically performing most of the ecological functions that make those systems look the way they do and appear the way they do. It is not a hyperbole to say that to preserve tropical ecosystems in their current state is to preserve their ant biodiversity, which is oftentimes decimated because of invasive species like fire ants and crazy ants and Argentine ants. Crazy ants are another kind of ant that just like skitter around. They're kind of neat. Go look up videos on crazy ants. Anyway, so the most common insect in the world, the most speciose insect in the world, is not a beetle. I mean, there are old statistics, like 1 out of every 4 species of animals is a beetle. That's true. Beetles are incredibly speciose, but almost every beetle we've ever looked at has a species-specific wasp that lays its eggs on or in that beetle that then burst out of its side and mature afterward after leaching it of resources, a parasitoid wasp that is unique to that species of beetle. Almost every beetle that we have any sense of, it has a host-specific parasitoid wasp. Amazing. So actually the most speciose animal in the world by far are wasps. And then when you include the fact that ants, which are incredibly speciose, and bees are basically just fancy wasps, and it's no hyperbole to say that wasps have taken over the world. Amazing. So, yep, parasitoid wasp. So when you think of a wasp, you probably think of like a flying, stinging, like venomous insect. Real life, it's not how they are. Most wasps are little tiny, like 1 millimeter long parasitoids that lay their young inside of beetles, like this poor beetle here, develop on the inside of it, and then burst out of it later on in life, completing its life cycle. Oh, I've got a huge amount of phlegm right behind my nose, so I'm going to probably go blow my nose in just a second. So wasps. Wasps evolved during the Jurassic period, which is the three sort of like dinosaur periods, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Wasps emerged in the Jurassic, but then all of the familiar families and the way that wasps look today evolved in the Cretaceous. So basically the wasps that we have today have been around for about 65 million years to like 100 million years. I know 65 million years ago is when it ended. I'm not sure when the Cretaceous started. Anyway, so most wasps are not social, that make little combs, that fly around and sting things. Most wasps live by themselves. They lay their eggs, and mothers lay their eggs on the inside of little host larvae, or inside of plants, or inside of eggs. The young develop on the inside of eggs, or larval insects or mature insects, or inside of plant materials, and then they burst out the side later on. Parasitoids, like these ichneumoniid wasps on the left-hand side here, or trichogramma wasps on the right-hand side, are incredibly host-specific. They have one host species that they look for, be it a beetle, a butterfly, a worm, an egg, a whatever. They find it, and they lay their eggs on the inside of it. So that's cool, because it means that if you have a pest insect that's like overwhelming your pea field, or your cornfield, or your apple orchard, that means that you can find a specific wasp, a parasitoid wasp, that will lay its eggs on those larvae and then rip them apart before they ever mature, consuming their resources. That's cool because you can have a very high level of biocontrol using these parasitoid wasps. Biocontrol is where you use the ecology of an enemy to suppress some focal pest species. So like you bring its predator or its parasite or its disease or whatever to mow down something that's hurting humanity. So we use biology to control a pest. Oftentimes these are disasters. We move some predator across the world to destroy some pest, and then we find out it doesn't eat it. It comes out at night, and it probably comes out during the day, or like it turns out that it loves to eat the native species more than the invasive. So normally, total disasters. But the nice thing about these parasitoid wasps is they only have one host that they exploit, that they rip apart. And so we know that we're not going to inadvertently have them attacking lots of other native fauna. They'll just destroy our pest species. Parasitoids oftentimes have a very short generation time. They lay hundreds of eggs. They are really good at finding their host because they only have one host that they focus on per species, usually. And they have turnover really quickly, right? The babies hatch out quite fast, and there are huge numbers of new adults flying around that mate and then start laying their eggs of their own. And that's nice because normally their generation time is much faster than their host species that they're exploiting. And so the nice thing about that is that it means that they can follow an outbreak. So if this pest species is beginning to have an outbreak in the field and you're like, oh my God, it's reproducing so fast, it's going to eat all of our crops, release these wasps. Even a small number of these wasps, they're good at finding their prey, i.e. these pest, we'll say beetles in your field. They're good at finding them. They mow them down, tons of eggs come out, and then their population grows very, very fast. These wasps grow very, very fast in terms of their population size, and so they can match the outbreak in real time and mow it down before it becomes really, really severe. Things like generalist predators, like spiders in a field, yes, they're good at suppressing pests, but their generation time is slower than a lot of the pest species that infect fields, that mow down our crops. So while the spiders are doing their best to mow, like their best, not trying, but although they kill lots of pests, when the pests reach an outbreak level, they just overwhelm the normal generalist predators that are there, and there aren't enough generalist predators to keep those outbreaks of those pests at bay. But these fast little wasps, teeny, teeny, tiny, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters in length, save us huge amounts of money. We spend a huge amount of money cultivating these things and releasing them in fields to suppress pest outbreaks that could cause famines otherwise. So many of these wasps are also gall forming, meaning they lay their eggs in the galls of on plant material, and then the plant material makes like a little sphere. That's called a gall. It's like a little tumor that it develops around those eggs of these wasps, and then the wasps develop on the inside of that gall and burst out later. So some wasps can become pretty bad, if they're gall forming, can become pretty bad crop pests in and of their own right, despite the fact that other species of wasps can outperform many generalist predators in terms of their biocontrol potential. So they can be both beneficial to humanity or costly to humanity, depending on whether or not they're gall-forming wasps or parasitoids that affect economically relevant crop pests. Parasitoid. A parasitoid is not a parasite. A parasite leaches the nutrients of its host, usually in a sublethal factor, and then in a sublethal way, and then goes about its merry way, completing its life cycle elsewhere. It's not lethal to the host. Parasitoids require a host's body to finish its life cycle and usually facilitate the development of its offspring. So these ichneumon wasps will lay their eggs in these larval beetles, we'll say, and then these larvae develop on the inside of the beetle, and then they burst out of the beetle later on in life, right? But they do that after leaching it of lots of resources, like a parasite, but then they kill the host when they rip out, right? So like an alien in the Aliens movies, like rips out of the host's chest. So it kills the host, right? And so you can think of parasitoids like predators that kill their prey, but take a long time getting to it. So parasitoids sound like parasites. They do produce their offspring in the interior of the host's body, but eventually they're going to kill that host under most conditions. So Aculeata. The Aculeata. The Aculeata are the stinging wasps that you're probably most familiar. These include jewel wasps, yellow jackets, hornets, swarming wasps, paper wasps, and then ants, and indeed bees as well. So all of these highfalutin wasps are wasps that have modified their ovipositor, which is that posterior extremity used to lay eggs, to be able to produce a stinger. Stinging, notably, is co-associated with the evolution of very high levels of sociality in bees and ants and paper wasps, yellow jackets, hornets, etc. So you might ponder, like, I wonder if the stinger facilitated these very high levels of sociality. And it stands to reason that that could be true, because having a stinger, if it's just one of you, might not be all that effective against lots of kinds of enemies. But working in concert to swarm sting an enemy to defend a central resource from something like a marauding bear or some rival society that's attacking you. If you have many stingers, then that's much more threatening to a much greater swath of potential enemies. This is the fortress hypothesis to the evolution of sociality, the idea that the ecology of needing to defend, the pressure of needing to defend a valuable resource from an enemy, and the benefits of swarming to overwhelm that enemy are what facilitate the evolution of very high levels of sociality. Consistent with that hypothesis, yes, the wasps, the hornets, yellow jackets, wasps you're familiar with, the ants and the bees all have that stinging, swarming thing, and they use it to defend a central fortress, like a colony, whether that be in the ground or in an acorn or in a tiny little paper nest beneath the leaf of a tree. All right, So stinging and the defense of a shared resource, i.e. the colony, against enemies and swarm defense might have facilitated the evolution of high levels of sociality and nucleata. Cool, whatever. That means it's possible. No one really knows, but that's a hypothesis that pops around out there. And it also seems to hold for lots of other taxa as well. So some very high level, very social wasps will evolve a social parasite strategy, and sometimes there are species of wasps that are only social parasites that basically fly around, pretend to be members of a colony, and then lay their eggs in the nests of social wasps. And then they get those social wasps, which are of a different species, usually, sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it's the same species, sometimes it's a different species, to rear their young, little cuckoo wasps that trick a host, sometimes the same species as them, oftentimes a different species than them, to rear their offspring. And if you think about it, the most likely kind of organism to infiltrate a society effectively and masquerade as a colony member is probably a close relative. And no surprise, most kleptoparasitic species are thought to have evolved from a split of their social ancestor and rogue lineage that just started to parasitize their parental lineage. And they already resemble them in lots of ways, morphologically, chemically, behaviorally. So they have a lot of the sort of access codes to pretend to be a colony member and to be able to exploit that colony. So the Vespidae is one very specific family of wasps among many families of wasps. And that's where almost all the wasps you think of occur. And those are the only ones that evolve very high levels of sociality. All right, so wasps, bees, yellow jackets, some ants, oftentimes you'll recognize they have a very characteristic warning color form that they've evolved over and over and over again, like yellow and black stripes. They've converged on the same signal is effective because it makes it makes it easier rather for enemies to evolve instincts or learn over the course of their lives that these stripes mean danger. So the fact that all the different wasps and bees converge on the same kinds of patterns that indicate a warning pattern helps produce a more salient, reliable, from evolution and learning angles, signals that help keep enemies at bay. An honest signal for you to leave these things the hell alone. No surprise, because many kinds of could-be enemies avoid these banding colors. Lots of other species will masquerade as these venomous, stinging insects, which are actually when they're actually totally harmless. So like there are things like flies that have evolved that banding coloration that benefit from that signal that all these venomous insects have evolved and converged on, and can pretend to be venomous when they're actually not paying any of those costs. But the key is that the average time that an observer sees this banding coloration, it's the real thing. It could actually sting you. And as long as that's true, evolution will tend to keep enemies towards a heightened level of awareness for warning coloration like these. It will keep the sensory systems of the observers attuned to avoiding that warning coloration, because on average, the signal is honest. And when the signal is honest and you don't attend to it, you get stung. And when it's a dishonest signal and you attend to it, you maybe miss a could-be food item that was pretending to be dangerous that actually wasn't. The cost of mistakenly not trusting the signal can be much greater than the cost of mistakenly trusting the signal when it's not actually accurate. All right. So basic wasp sociality. Most wasps are just a mother and their young. They either lay their, even among the Vespidae, it's a mother and her young. She rears her young by bringing them food. Normally, this is pre-killed or immobilized insects that they then feed to their larval young. Some of these species exhibit, or most species are a solitary nesting brood and the mother. Some of them will make communal nests, so like they'll put their nests next to each other, but each mother still only tends to her young. And then most of these nests can be made out of some sort of biomaterial, so saliva and mud, or saliva and paper pulp, or they can be inside of grasses or reeds or whatever, right? So these mothers go and subdue prey by singing it, bringing it to their young. Many mothers will sometimes put their nests next to each other, but they're not really helping each other beyond just converging on the same hospitable site to put their nests. There might be advantages, but they're not being too chummy with each other. And most of them are not even doing that. Social wasps, so among the Vespidae, have these giant paper nests, right? So hornets, yellow jackets, wasps, paper wasps, all make a combination of plant materials and saliva to create these combs. Sometimes these combs are covered up with a papery exterior. Sometimes the combs are open faced, like most wasps you're probably familiar with. The brood are reared communally in these little cells, all next to each other. Sometimes these colonies are founded by a single mother, and all the other wasps around her are her daughters. Sometimes it's founded by a group of could-be mothers that then basically fight for the rights to be the true queen that lays the majority of the eggs, and then all the other ones just become helpers. So they can either be haplomatrotic, one queen who then produces her entire workforce to assist her, or they could be pleiomatrotic, many queens join together, but then one really takes the queen role and everybody else becomes a subservient worker. The nest sites can vary in preference somewhat. They can lay their nests in trees or shrubs, in the interior of those plants, on the undersides of leaves, and oftentimes near water sources. And that preference of where to lay their nests is oftentimes characteristic of genera and sometimes specific species. Colony phenology, so usually there's one founding event in temperate climates from southern Georgia up through most of Canada. There's a founding event of queens each year that she lays her eggs, or they lay their eggs if there's multiple queens. They produce a workforce that then helps to rear many more workers. And then later on in the season, they produce one giant set of individuals that will become queens themselves. And then they mate just before it winters again. And they go basically sit in little invaginations in the soil or in leaf litter in things called hibernacula, which are like little overwintering sites where all the queens just basically all hunker down and prevent themselves from freezing solid. And then the next spring, they leave these hibernacula, which are like little hibernating dens, and go and found new nests. Ideally, they want to find a nest that was left over from last year that was already constructed. That's great. But if they can't find that, they have to go start on their own nest. And so, of course, there are fights over really nice nests from last year. And if you found a colony with multiple queens, you can be more likely to secure that pre-existing nest from other rivals, which are oftentimes different species, trying to recolonize nests from last year, because building a nest from scratch is hard work. So, but as you move closer and closer to the tropics, there's no longer this discrete founding event, rearing event, swarming reproduction event, and hibernacula phases that are in strict sequence. Instead, it becomes more fuzzy. So there's basically round the year reproduction as you get closer and closer to the tropics. There can be some seasonality associated with rains, but oftentimes that's not the case. So I just conveyed these materials. So haplomatrosis, single founding queen; pleiomatrosis, many queens found the colony together, and then they sort out who's going to be boss. You know who the boss is going to be if you found the colony on your own. There's a foundress stage. The single queen lays her first set of eggs and rears them all on her own. The first post-emergence individuals, young adults, are small. They're not that impressive because they were reared by a single mother. But then that first set of workers then assist their mother, the queen, or mothers, if there were multiple queens that scrounged reproduction, in rearing the next generation of workers. So the next set of workers that are reared by the first set of workers and the mother, or mothers, will be larger and more healthy. This will go on for a few rounds of producing workers, depending on how long the season is. And then towards the end of the season, they switch from producing only workers to producing a combination of both workers and queens and drones. And that's usually they start producing those on the latter third of the season. They produce as many of those as possible. Then those queens and drones fly away from the colonies. They mate with queens and drones from other colonies, and then the drones die. And the queens go find little spots in the soil, basically near the soil surface or within the soil, to protect themselves from freezing over the winter. Pleiometrosis, foundresses are often slightly related. So the queens that found those colonies together, they get some indirect fitness benefits of that behavior, because usually they're related to some degree. Like the relatedness is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2, so they're less than half sibs, but oftentimes they're from related mothers or share a father or something like that, or are at least somewhat closely related. So they're getting indirect fitness kickbacks. So even those queens that don't become the queen in charge, there's a good chance that the queen in charge is at least a relative of hers, a distant relative. And pleiometrosis queens are more individualized. So when they found societies together, they have pleiometrotic queens that were found, many queens found a society together. Their faces usually have unique markings that are individual specific, which allows them to sort out, once they knew who the boss is, they know that that boss has a specific facial pattern that makes her recognizable relative to all of the other queens in the society. So we know who is the boss and who are the subordinates based on these little masks that are individually specific. Haplometrotic species that are only founded, where colonies are only founded by one queen, all their faces look alike. So pleiometrosis facilitates the evolution of greater individuality in their faces. In some cases, these colonies will be founded a little bit at the late portion of the fall of the prior year, and the queens can remember each other's faces, who won those initial battles from before the winter. So they'll fight a little bit. This happens only sometimes, but it happens often enough that we know that it happens. They'll figure out who the bosses are based on their facial recognitions, these little paintings on their faces. They'll then go into hibernacula, not see each other for a few months. In Canada, it could be 5-6 months. And then they all emerge out again. And the ones that co-found a nest together again, they remember from months ago the individual facial recognition patterns of the queens that were in charge or were likely to be in charge based on those original conflicts between the queens that found the colony together. They basically beat each other up and see who's in the best condition, and that individual becomes the primary egg layer, i.e. the queen. So interestingly, there's already an association between these facial markings and condition. So even before they duke it out, these queens oftentimes can tell who's most likely to be the strongest queen. Individuals that have no black markers on their faces, they're more likely to be subordinates. Having small black marks mean you're weak, but you could be a dominant individual. Having more elaborate marks means that you're even more likely to be a dominant individual. But then having bifurcated marks with highly structured edges, like these little individuals that have like horns, especially these sharp horns here, or this little triad individual, that conveys that those individuals are very high body status, which means they're very likely to win their contests. So there's an honest signal. So when they're developing those markings, there's a link already physiologically with their basically research holding potential, so that before they even start fighting, they know who they should probably avoid and who's a viable opponent, and so they don't waste too much time fighting in contests that are superfluous, and they can start assisting the primary reproductive individual, which is very likely to have a very highly structured yellow and black face. In these pleiometrotic species. Disorderly individuals, if we like paint these artificial black markings on like this gal here, they're punished hard. So if they appear like they have those black markings and they're not of high quality, they're basically bullied really, really badly in these initial dominance hierarchy phases during early stages of pleiometrosis. So if you artificially paint these black these black markings yellow, or vice versa, it results in high levels of punishment towards the individuals that are masquerading as a tier of quality that they actually are not. So social enforcement keeps that signal honest. Interestingly, we can teach these wasps individual facial patterns, and they can see them on little computer screens like a primate, and they can be taught pretty sophisticated learning associations. This face is good, this face is bad, this face beats you up, this face is good to you. And these other queens can memorize those things for months. Interestingly, they can do the same with little patterns like these, right? Patterns that have nothing to do with what they see in nature, or food item patterns, right? These wasps can learn very high levels of associations for long periods of time and reliably associate them for weeks or months. The key is they have to have antennae. If you have these little focal wasps pay attention to stimuli that have no antennae, they can't memorize the faces. They have to learn the faces are there and they have these antennae. If the antennae are all over the place, they don't know where to attend to the stimulus, and so they can't memorize it. If it has no antennae, they can't memorize it. They can memorize their own species faces or artificially, experimentally manipulated faces as long as they have antennae flanking them. So they've evolved to pay attention to whatever's inside of the antennae. If you put antennae onto these patterns, they can learn those patterns because they've evolved to pay attention to what's inside of the antennae. So the neat thing about this is that these pleometrotic species of wasps have evolved to pay attention to anything that's flanked by antennae because they've evolved to pay attention to faces the same way you and I have. And these are tiny little wasps, and they're good at memorizing them because it's important for their kind of society. I hope that's clear. I think it's quite cool. So they're kind of smart, at least and in this one social capacity, because it's relevant for figuring out who's who. All right. The last element inside of this lecture today, I'm exhausted. I feel like I've been yelling at you for like an hour. I don't know how long it's been, but I'm tired. I normally have breakaway sessions that you guys would have in class, but and that would give me some time to relax and recuperate before I like get up there and act for you guys again. But like without those breaks, I become somewhat tired. Anyway, so the last thing I want you to know is what makes workers. So when a colony produces queens versus additional workers, in wasp societies, the only thing that's different between queens and workers is how much food they give them. The individuals that become queens that then go mate and found the society the next year are sometimes being reared next to workers that will never be able to do that. They're just going to help their society. All that's differentiating those workers from those queens is how much food they're getting. And that's interesting because it basically means that those queens and those workers that they spawn can manipulate who becomes a worker and stays and helps versus who can become reproductive and goes and founds their own society. And the way that queens can ensure that they always have helpers is they just pick a few of them and just choke them of resources, right? Good God, don't give them all equal resources. They might all leave you and go found their own societies. But if you, I don't know, throttle them, a few of them of resources, then they know that they're not in good enough condition to go found their own society, and they don't even try. They stay here and help mommy. This is called the parental manipulation hypothesis, that the way that the worker queen castes evolved was because there was natural selection on queens to cause the haves, which would replace themselves as daughtering their own societies and be queens like their mothers. And then there would be the have-nots, which would be of such low quality, of such low provisioning, that they couldn't go reliably found their own society. They wouldn't be able to make it on their own. So they have to sit here and help mommy. So this hypothesis sounds really dark, but it seems like it's basically true. So, and among all these wasps, most of the times workers are just queens that didn't get enough resources, and so they can't really go found their own societies. And so you can determine how many queens you produce by how much food you give them, and you can make really, really fat queens that are very likely to be successful, and then everybody else just sits around and makes sure that this colony persists and is defended, and that the next bolus of queens will be of the highest quality possible. And then if you look at things like honeybees or most ants, they're just elaborations on this system. Like royal jelly is just really nutritious, really physiologically active materials that they give some individuals and not others, and that makes a queen. So most queen versus worker determination systems are just differential provisioning, right? You can make queens by giving something either a lot of food or a special kind of food, and that will make it a queen. And everybody else is choked off of that resources. No cake for them, and they're going to become workers. And they have to help you because you gave them no choice. Neat, huh? Anyway, so with that uplifting note, I mean, nature's not kind, folks. I will let you guys run away, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this lecture, and I'll talk to you guys about ants and bees on Monday. Take it easy, guys. Have a good one. Bye.